All right, everyone. Let's do chapter 1 in the Marger book. All right. So what I have here is the book is really just straightforward outlined. I took the outline out of the chapter, and I'm not going to talk about all of it, but I do want to talk about different components, if you will. Okay. So. All right, so the first thing that we're going to be doing, here's the book, Martin Marger, Social Inequality, Patterns and Processes, 6th edition. This will be the book we're using this summer. Okay, so the first section I have here is what is social inequality and why is there social inequality? The questions here are the questions that the book's going to end up talking about, and and there they are. But what is social inequality and why does it exist are interesting questions. Part of the problem with social inequality is that it's so obvious that it ends up being a taken for granted fact, to the point where you don't recognize that there's something to study there until you start to actually dig in, right? And so, what actually is it? How is it that some people have more money than others? How is it some people have better jobs than others? How is it some people have different sorts of reputation than others? Why is it that a kid growing up on the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota, how is it that that person has one life to live, and it's a life that's so very different than someone like Paris Hilton? Why does Paris Hilton get such a better life chance than that other kid? What's actually going on there? And those end up being really deep, tricky questions, and we'll spend time talking about them as we go. Okay. We'll end up talking a lot about economics in this class, so there's that. The next one is power. Like, what does it actually mean to have power? How do you execute power? How do you obtain power in the first place? We'll talk about all of that as we go through the semester. How is it that there are power inequalities? Talk a little bit about race and ethnic, gender inequality. We'll talk a little bit about gender inequality. I don't know if we'll be able to answer how to move towards greater social equality, but we can hope. Okay. Now, part of the problem with inequality, and part of the way that we try and deal with it with sociology, is inequality is such a taken for granted that it's hard to actually take apart. Number one, we already covered that. Number two, however, is that when we try and talk about inequality, most of what we have are opinions, right? We all have some sort of operating hypotheses on how the world works the way it does and why it works the way it does. Both of our major political parties have understandings of where inequality comes from and whether or not it's a good thing. The old-fashioned social philosophers had, they thought a lot about inequality. Every religious group has an understanding of how different people should relate to each other inside of their religion. So what does sociology have to offer this? What is sociology doing differently? And the answer is sociology is trying to be empirical about this. We're trying to be as scientific as possible. And that means that, we accept that people have opinions, and that's fine, but we put opinions on the on the back burner or up on the shelf for a little bit while we talk more about... Hello, Chad. Okay, phone call's over. Back to where we were. So the sociological mode is coming as a way to understand social inequality. Comes to us from Peter Berger, who's the same sociologist that wrote Berger and Luckman, Social Construction of Reality in the 50s and 60s, and went on to have a career doing sociology of religion. But for Berger, part of the sociological mode is, as it says here, going beyond the obvious, which means when someone has a question, or rather an answer, more importantly an answer, about something like inequality, the first answer, the obvious answer, often isn't really enough. Or, as we've said earlier, being able to look at something that you never before thought much about because it seemed obvious. And when you realize that, and then you realize you haven't given it any thought at all because it was obvious, right? So it's a little bit like asking, how does vision work? It's not until you understand the physics of light that you realize how surprising it is that we can see anything, or how air works. If you lived in a world where we didn't understand wind and air and we're trying to think about what it was and why people breathed, what would you have to say? But before that, it would just be a part of everyday obvious life. So because we're trying to peer behind the obvious, that's where this next concept of his, the lens of sociology, comes in. In sociology's trying to exist apart from politics, trying to exist apart from religion and theology, all these other tools that tell you how society works, or how society, well, basically how people should and do relate to each other. There are elements of truth to those other ways of seeing things, but there are also hidden falsehoods too. So how do we do that? We try and think empirically. We want to know if we can measure a thing. We want to know if we can replicate a thing. And if our explanations are correct, not only will we be able to replicate, but we might be able to make small but correct predictions or guesses about where the future is heading. It's not in red here, but that's exactly what description, explanation, and prescription are getting at. The first level to understanding something is to be able to describe what you see, and to describe it as empirically and non-value oriented as you can. The next step is to be able to explain it. I think A happens because B. When this happens, it causes that. You know, the why of a situation, not just the what. And the prescription comes in if you've got the description and the causal forces correct, then you should be able to make guesses or predictions about what's going to happen next. Marx is an interesting example of this precisely because he wasn't completely right. His description of capitalism is fun and often very correct. His explanation of what's driving it may or may not be right. He's got an understanding of abstraction. He's got an understanding of historical inevitability, and those are good. But when he tried to project forward based on what he knew, it didn't pan out the way he thought. So that means that we have to essentially think, well, where was Marx wrong? How can we go back and tweak what he said to see if there's anything worth doing? Okay, or worth saving from that. The last bit here, Mill's troubles and issues. So C. Wright Mills is one of the more famous recent sociologists, quickly working his way into being one of our classic writers. But he was writing in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. He gave us the sociological imagination. He gave us the power elite. And troubles and issues come from the sociological imagination. Essentially, when you're having problems in your life, you're experiencing troubles. And those troubles can be any sort of thing. He uses examples, well, if you cheat on your spouse and your spouse divorces you, well, you have troubles. If you get fired from your job, that's causing you troubles, right? Now, troubles are personal, individual experiences, and they may be the fault of that individual, the consequence of that individual's actions, but they may also be a response to something that's going on in the outside world. And those would be issues. So that when the divorce rate goes from 10% in the 50s to 50% in the 2010s, while the individual reasons for individual divorces certainly still matter, clearly a social force has changed how we think about marriage, and that's an issue. When I show up late and do a poor job and get fired from work, well, that's certainly a trouble. But when 2008 happens and tens of thousands of people are laid off all over the country, that's a social issue. It's a result of social forces. It has everything to do with the history that was going on when those folks were when they were laid off. So that's troubles and issues. I may put a link to the sociological imagination in the course section. All right. Next slide here, number 4. So let me just skip to the red, wealth, power, and prestige. So when a sociologist talks about social stratification or inequality, we'll often talk about these 3 things. It actually comes a little bit from Weber, but we'll talk about that later in the semester. Now, wealth is specific. Wealth is not just money, it's money in the bank, and that's different from income. People will talk about income. Well, someone who's rich, maybe you think someone who makes $500,000 a year is rich. Well, that's income. Wealth is actually what you own. And it's possible to have a $500,000 a year income and not be saving any of it. So if you lose your job, in 6 months you're bankrupt, just like the auto worker in Detroit. Whereas if you have wealth, because you have money in the bank, it's not money in the bank that you can spend for a while. It's money in the bank that you can invest to make more money. So if you have wealth, it doesn't matter whether you have a job or not, because that wealth is generating its own income. Now, when you think of wealth, if you're a layperson, you probably think of money in the bank like winning the lottery. You're like, yahoo, I got $5 million in the bank. But if you think a little bit deeper, you have to recognize that all that money is an abstraction of something else. So I win the lottery and I put $5 million in the bank. The bank turns around and uses that $5 million to buy property that it can collect rents on, or to buy shares in companies that it can collect dividend payments on. Essentially, it can take that money and loan it to people to buy houses and charge interest, and to buy cars and to charge interest. So wealth really actually is about money used as a tool to make more money, essentially capital. That's where sociologists are thinking about money when they're talking about wealth. And that's different than income. Income is just the money that's coming in, and there's a tremendous amount of inequality in that, but not as much as there is with wealth. Now, prestige is hard to put a finger on. It's hard to pinpoint. It's a little bit challenging to measure, but it exists nevertheless. Prestige could be the the cool kids in high school. What made them cool? I have no idea. But everybody cared what they were doing. Even if we were all doing the same things, it was the cool kids that people talked about. Of course, I'm thinking of Heathers, the movie, which is way too old for most of the people in this class. Prestige is a measure of reputation, a measure of how people feel about you socially, and it's actually very important. There are plenty of jobs where you don't make much money, but you have a lot of prestige that make the job worth doing. Something like an example I'll often use is an old-fashioned Catholic priest. Not going to make a lot of money, but you have people who look to you for advice, for guidance. You know, if you play your cards right politically in the church, you can run a church and cause really cool things to happen. All of that good feeling, that's prestige. Yeah, so there you go. And people vary a lot on prestige as well. Another example that I would use sometimes might be a stripper. A stripper in a tourist community could easily make, if they were doing their job well, could easily make $75,000 or $100,000 a year, you know, in Miami or Vegas, and that's great money. But you might not call up your grandma and say, "Hey, guess what I'm doing to make all this money?" Because the prestige for being a stripper isn't quite that high. The money's much better than being a priest, but the prestige is much lower. A priest, the money is terrible, but the prestige is high. Okay? Now, the last one here, power, the last one in red. Power is the ability to make somebody do what you want them to do, regardless of whether they want to or not. And power takes two forms. This is one of the ways that the political parties differentiate each other. One way is to force someone to do it. So when conservatives complain about taxes, what frustrates them is if they don't pay taxes, they're going to get a knock on the door someday, and someone's going to come and take money out of their bank account, or is going to physically put them in jail until they're willing to pay it. They're going to be physically forced into doing what it is the government wants them to do. When the military gets deployed abroad, they're going to physically force whatever it is that needs to be done. Of course, the other team is going to try and physically force back, but that's one sort of power. The other sort of power is financial power or leverage. So when somebody complains about Walmart coming into a community, well, Walmart can't force anybody to do anything. What they can do is they can make it, they can use their immense wealth to really make it attractive for a farmer to sell that plot of land so that they can put a Walmart on the edge of town. The Walmart can put the Walmart on the edge of town, and they can, through their financial power, really kind of leverage the city into laying out sewer and water and roadways at a reduced cost for them. No one forced them. No one went downtown with a shotgun and said, "You're going to build us a road." But if you're on the other side of that, it can feel like it when you're being leveraged into doing something you don't want to do because of your financial situation. When people complain about some respectable old guy at Walmart who's been reduced to being a greeter, reduced quote unquote, for the old guy, his choice was no job or a job at Walmart. He had a certain amount of choice. No one forced him to do it, but when someone complains, someone who doesn't like Walmart complains, what they're looking at is, for that old guy, he didn't really have much choice. Very popular today. He didn't have very much choice. It was, staying at home being bored or eating cat food or whatever it was that was worse than an $8 a job at Walmart. So he was leveraged. He didn't really have a whole lot of he didn't have a whole lot of leverage to bring to against Walmart, but Walmart has all the leverage in the world to bring to him. And those tend to be the left side, the Democrats, who are more concerned about financial power, and the conservatives tend to be more concerned about physical power. You'll notice, however, that both are real and can be problematic. So I'd prefer to keep you to keep your mind open about both of them. Okay, stratification forms, that's boring. Well, you'll read it. Okay, so structured inequality. Probably an easy way to think about this is to consider, someone who grows up in a $75,000 home in Macon, Georgia, who their friends and family are, what schools they go to, and who their network is, and compare that person to someone growing up in a $75,000 home near the Bay Area out in San Francisco. Of course, the cost of living is a little bit different, but just pretend that that part's the same, so that these two kids are both having the same material upbringing. But if you're in Macon, Georgia, what are the networks that you're exposed to, right? We have an agricultural economy that's still important. Over in Fort Valley, there's still Bluebell buses. I don't know how healthy they are or not, but maybe you could get an internship there. If you're willing to go to Atlanta for your networking, there's Coke and AT&T. So there are certain players around, but there aren't quite as many as are out in San Francisco. Not only that, but our players are going to be more relegated to the older economy. And in San Francisco, what you're seeing are all the players who are a part of the newer economy. So two kids growing up with about the same material well-being, about the same education, but growing up here in Macon versus over there in San Francisco, you're going to end up with, because they're both enmeshed in different social structures, they're actually going to have a different set of life chances, a different set of opportunities that are open to them. And a kid who grew up in Macon on $75,000 who wanted a job in software, the right answer might be to go get a job at Starbucks in the Bay Area for a little while he built the network that would get him or her into that situation. Now, that's a structure that's very different for people who are at the same economic level, but what about people who are at different economic levels? You can be in the same community, and the kid who's growing up in a family that has $25,000 a year of income, the kid that grows up in the family with $75,000 a year in income, and the kid that grows up with $150,000 in income, those three different kids, even in the same community, have a completely different set of social context. They have different schools, different schoolings, different friends and peer groups, and they have different networks that they know, and their parents have different networks that they have access to. So even though they're all in the same area, maybe they're all here in Macon, those are three completely different sets of outcomes, or at least sets of opportunities that lead to outcomes. Now, nobody has to be racist, nobody has to be sexist, nobody has to be classist. Just the simple environmental influence is enough to ensure that, on average, people tend to end up sort of where they started out. So this kid ends up here, this kid ends up here, and this kid ends up here. And that's structured inequality. So there you go. Now, let me bounce down here to Weber again. Weber gives us this notion of life chances. You may have heard me mention this in intro or social problems, but the idea of life chances is nice because what Weber is doing here is allowing us a balance of the free will of the individual and the exogenous influence of his or her social context. Okay, so if, I'm wondering if I can do this. My favorite example is George Bush and me, right? So George Bush is the son of George Bush. These are East Coast families. They're Yale educated. They've had 3 or 4 generations of wealth, some of it coming from oil money, but money before that. So George Bush is clearly from the American elite no matter what. Now, he could be a success in life, or he could be a failure in life. And in fact, he had a rough beginning. He had a few setbacks before he started to do well. But then once he put things together and succeeded, certainly being president is winning the game, right? President. But even George Bush, as an utter failure, as a trust fund kid with no income, whose family is kind of embarrassed and just supports him to keep him by, may well have a better material life than, for instance, Mike Gibbons. So here I am. If I screw up in life, for me, the bottom is quite a bit lower than it is for George Bush. And even if I succeed wildly in life, wildly, maybe I put away a couple of million teaching college. But even if I make $5 million teaching college and put that in the bank account, I still am not going to have access to the kind of capital Bush has because of his family. I'm not going to have access to the networks. I'm not going to have access to the folks in power in America who make things happen. So my best is still not as good as George Bush's worst. Now, that captures both the context, the deterministic or exogenous components, but it also captures the sort of free will and the game. Because I could have ended up down here in jail, or I could have ended up here with a couple of $1 million in the bank. The truth is I'm somewhere in the middle. So that's up to me and how I play the opportunities, but there's still these large issues, that large contextual bits that are left out. And there are lots of people who start life way worse off than I do, and their best may not be as good as my worst, right? That's just sort of the way it is. Okay. All right. Is that everything on that one? Ideology and legitimation. I could say, let me say something about stability. So in physics, you have this notion of, let's make this quiet. In physics, you have this notion of centrifugal force. When you spin something, the centrifugal force wants to pull it off. It's why they don't put the spinning carousels in kids' playgrounds anymore, because you want to spin it until little children go flying off, and that's not a good thing. All right. Now, at the same time, you've also got centripetal force, which is what holds that spinning thing together. Well, societies, in its own way, it's a little bit similar. There are forces which are pulling it apart. There are friction, which is causing trouble on the inside, but then there's also a stability force which is holding it together. And that stability force, this is what the functionalists are usually writing about, that the centrifugal force or pulling apart force is what the conflict theorists are usually writing about. And it doesn't really matter which way you're approaching it, the question of how or why society stays together, these three issues here do actually help that, right? So culture, people believe the situation, people believe in the community, people believe in the way things work, and so they go along with it because that's the way it should be. Individual and organizational power, our institutions have a certain amount of power, which they're not going to get torn apart if they can help it. They're going to try and hold things together. But as soon as you put a conflict spin on it, you end up with ideology and legitimation. So it's not just that, oh, this is the way it is and people believe in it. It's that this is the way it should be, and I believe in it, even if I'm getting screwed. Or it might not even occur to me that I'm getting screwed because I believe in it. I end up talking a lot about this in class when I'm talking about, if you've been in my other classes, the brick and the cloud. This here is the cloud. And we'll end up talking more about that. All right, so then let's go to this page. Now, part of what makes the American system good is that we do actually have quite a bit more mobility than many traditional societies, and we have more mobility than some contemporary societies. Where people will complain is that we don't have nearly as much mobility as I think the average American perhaps thinks. We can explore that later. We'll get back to that later. But you can have individual mobility, as it says. You can have group mobility. What's left out of this is intergenerational mobility. So if I come from a working class family and, I don't know, I go get a math degree and then go out to Wall Street and make a couple of $1 million, I've improved my standing in the world. You know, I came from here and I made money and I went up to here. That's individual mobility. If my folks came here from, I don't know, from the Ukraine and had to get janitorial jobs because it was a new society and they didn't have the certifications and they just had to get jobs here, and then I go from that to the Wall Street trader job, then that's intergenerational mobility, right? Once you bring my folks into it as working class people, then you have intergenerational mobility. You can also have group mobility, but the example that comes to mind is one, for me at least, of prestige. So before 9/11 happened in New York, it was the case that New York cops weren't necessarily held in very high esteem. But when 9/11 happened and the police and the first responders did everything they could to respond very well, on September 12th, all of a sudden the NYPD was very, very highly thought of. You know, now for the individual guy that just goes to his job, on September 10th he goes to work, on September 11th he goes to work and has the worst day ever. On September 12th he goes to work. Each day he just goes to work and he just does his job copping like he's supposed to. But in the meantime, because history steps in, his whole group goes from, you know, mediocre prestige to high prestige. Similarly, someone who was a Middle Eastern immigrant to the United States driving cab, on September 10th he's just driving cab. He's just another foreign cab driver. Like New York is full of immigrants and nobody would think anything about it. But on September 12th, all of a sudden Americans are nervous about the Middle East, and him and his friends all go a notch down on social prestige. And that would be group mobility on these things. Okay. All right. So, okay. This last component is equity versus liberty and distributive justice. This is one of the places in the conversation where politics again enters this discussion. So, as it says, for equity, the distribution of society's rewards in a just manner. Well, if we leave aside just for a moment and talk about just equity, if everything's distributed equally across society so that there's no inequality whatsoever, that would be one extreme, and one part of that extreme would be no one would, the very definition of that extreme would be that no one would have any more than anyone else. On the downside, on the plus side, no one would be poor by that definition, but on the downside, you also wouldn't have any reason for anyone to try hard to win the game, because by default there would be no game. Okay, the flip side of that, it would be extreme liberty. Now, the way that we understand liberty is, the swing your fist. I'm free to swing my fist as much as I want, at least until it hits your nose, at which point my freedom bumps into your right to not get punched in the nose. Okay? But in an extreme situation of liberty, I would be free to do whatever I wanted. And slavery is probably the most extreme version of that, insofar as if I could go and get a posse and some guns and capture people and make them work for me, then that would be what would be to stop me, right? So with those two extremes, you have to recognize that our system is one in the middle, and the equity side, the fairness side, or more equal side, tends to be democratic or left or liberal in our political environment, and the liberty side, the freedom side, is going to tend to be conservative or right or Republican. Now, this is painting with a fairly broad brush, but you hopefully understand. The two parties are in tension with each other over this freedom versus fairness perspective, and that's probably okay. Yeah, it's probably okay. Now, recognizing that tension, the way that you think things should be laid out, that's where distributive justice comes in. And the discussion from the book is how society's values resources should be apportioned, who should get what. So if this really is just the solution you have to sorting out the tension between these two, right? If you think you should be free to try and achieve whatever you want, you can start whatever business you want, you can make as much money as you possibly can, even if it means fibbing to people or promising something and then not delivering in terms of goods and services, then that's the extreme over here. You should be free to make money even if it harms the environment. How far do we go? Similarly, all the way over on the other hand are the other folks who say, well, sure, you can try and make money. Sure, you can start a business. But if you're going to pay someone less than $15 an hour to work, then it's actually not fair. You're exploiting that person. You're making all this money off of them. That's not right either. So distributive justice as an idea is really the solution that we as a society, or even you as an individual, have to how do we balance freedom versus equality, right? And sometimes it's a little bit easier to think of this outside of the world of money, at least for a little bit, until we bring it back and start thinking about it in a way that applies to this class. But if I have a big Harley, because I like loud motorcycles, of course it's my freedom to blast my motorcycle, to have a loud motorcycle, but my neighbors might not think that it's awesome for me to be revving up my Harley all morning at 6 in the morning on the way to work, right? Well, so where does my freedom to own that loud motorcycle and use that loud motorcycle start to impinge upon my neighbor's desire to not have to listen to my loud motorcycle? You can see the same thing. Environmental arguments are great this way. You can see the same thing in terms of a diesel truck. So it's always fun to rev it up and blow some coal. But what about the kid in the next car over who's asthmatic? Is it, yeah, I'm free to rev my engine, but if I'm putting out clouds of black soot, is that something that this kid in the next car over should have to deal with or not, right? Those are just two examples. You can go a little bit far the other way. I mean, in what world, how far do I take protecting the kid with asthma? Should nobody ever be allowed to have peanuts on an airplane because someone might have a peanut allergy? Well, considering that sometimes peanut allergies kill people, maybe that's a bad example. But if my kid has asthma, can I call up the local coal-fired power plant and tell them to stop making power for everybody because my kid has asthma, right? All of these are things that balance each other. And there's no real easy answer to any of these. There are issues that have to balance each other out, right? We can't just say, oh, it's all about freedom, because everything we do, in the real world impacts other people, and it's not all about being protected because at some point you have to step out of the bubble wrap and engage with the world, which might not be exactly the world that you want, right? So these things have to be balanced. Okay, very good. Thank you.